Video games have been around for a very long time and have found their way into pop culture. There are those who want to preserve these games for future generations to know about and experience. These people would see video games as pieces of art. They're not wrong about this, but comparing a video game to a piece by Van Gogh has its issues when it comes to preservation. Something like the Mona Lisa was not something made for mass production and commercial distribution. It's a painting made by one person which held much value to the people, so it's been preserved through time. This isn't the same as a video game no one played and was a commercial flop being preserved by the company who made it. A company isn't going to go out of its way to preserve what proved to be a failed commercial product. Same can be said for paintings. There are some things which are just junk and deserve to go down the memory hole. The vast majority of games are shovelware. For every Tears of the Kingdom, Baldur's Gate 3, or Black Myth Wukong, there's 100 games made which are forgettable rubbish. The Switch has over 11,000 games in its library, and the average gamer probably knows a couple hundred of them and only deem half of those worth playing. Shovelware is why Atari crashed and burned in the 80s, and why Nintendo put restrictions on developers for the NES. Nintendo, in particular, has been under much scrutiny for not preserving their games, and I'm not sure why. The majority of their titles, which are deemed to be valuable, are commercially available today. They have the Virtual Console, which had tons of their retro titles available for download, and have continued this with Nintendo Switch Online. Granted, NSO is not as comprehensive as Virtual Console due to licensing issues related to being a game subscription service. Nevertheless, looking at the games which are actually popular and have a significant following, Nintendo has, in fact, made these games available to the public in some form or fashion. You even had the craze with the retro hardware with Nintendo Classic Series. Both retro systems were well received. The real sore spot, however, is how Nintendo deals with emulation. This is the most prominent way for games to be preserved, and it's a subject which needs its own video. I would suggest Nintendo is less concerned about the existence of emulation and more concerned with protecting their most valuable intellectual properties. The most recent situation which proves this was the situation with Vimslayer, a ROM site which has been around for more than 20 years. Nintendo sent copyright takedowns to the site, and many games were removed. What the angry anti-Nintendo mob won't tell you is the vast majority of the ROMs on this site are still up and downloadable. The only thing Nintendo did was take down their major IP titles like Mario, Zelda, Pokemon, Kirby, Metroid, and so on. However, games such as Ninja Gaiden, Contra, Mega Man, Castlevania, and others like it are still available for download on the site. This may not last long because many of these are available on Nintendo's eShop. The point is, Nintendo only went after their own licensed material, which they have in fact made available for sale on their storefronts. It's also quite disingenuous of Vimslayer to say these games, which Nintendo and other companies took down, are no longer on sale, when they have continued to be distributed commercially through various digital outlets. Some feel they shouldn't be paying full price for games which are over a decade old. I don't begrudge those people who say this. I only ask for these people to be consistent. Many of these people would pay full price for Twilight Princess and Wind Waker HD remakes. Everyone creamed their pants over the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection for games which are more than 20 years old. They are being sold pre-order for $50, but the physical copies will probably end up being full price. The Mona Lisa is jealously preserved because it's considered by the public to be a landmark work of art. You can't say that for Action 52. Super Mario Bros. Is the Mona Lisa of video games and has been made available commercially to this day. Some don't want to pay a subscription to essentially rent games they want to play. Again, no problem with that line of thinking, but let's be consistent. Don't bash NSO while praising Game Pass and PlayStation Plus. All three are quote-unquote game rental services. No one really has a problem with renting games or paying full price for old games. Everyone picks and chooses and will break these rules for their favorite games. Nothing wrong with it. It's all about value at the end of the day. We all rented games from Blockbuster back in the day. Imagine if you paid $20 a year and you can play whatever games were on those Blockbuster shelves and you could keep them for as long as you want. You would have been in heaven as a kid. I think it's unrealistic and unreasonable for any company to make every single game they ever made commercially available. Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, etc. are not video game museums. They're video game businesses, or at least businesses in the video game market. Preservation is not their concern. They're here to sell you a product. If the product is a failure with no following, there's no reason for them to preserve it. ROM sites are perfectly fine from the standpoint of getting obscure games hardly anyone has played or knows about. But the more popular ROM sites are the ones hosting games which are well known and, in fact, are commercially available. Mother 3 can be had on NSO, only in Japan, because of legitimate legal hurdles. People bashing Nintendo for game preservation constantly bring this game up without knowing the facts. Another thing some people forget is Nintendo's eShop. What you don't see on NSO most likely will be there. They have a huge library of Neo Geo games and a number of Sega and Capcom arcade classics. Much of what Virtual Console had can be had from the eShop. Navigation issues aside, the games are there. The eventual demise of the Virtual Console were due to people not buying games on the service. When digital media was new, Virtual Console did very well. Once digital media became commonplace, Virtual Console tanked. Those complaining about ROM site takedowns don't realize Nintendo is doing this because they have many of these games on the Nintendo eShop. We also have to understand licensing. Nintendo does not have publishing rights for every game in their retro library. In fact, they only have publishing rights to a small fraction of their library. If they can't get licensing, they can't host the games on their digital platforms. Do they have every game in their back catalog on NSO and on the eShop? No, and they never will. They have, however, done a good job of making the games they do have publishing rights to available one way or another. There are some curious omissions from NSO in the eShop. The Game Boy and GBA Pokemon games are nowhere to be found, and we've got nothing from GameCube, Wii, DS, 3DS, or Wii U. I don't think it's from lack of trying, as the Mother 3 situation shows. Game Freak, who owns 33% of Pokemon, doesn't want those Pokemon titles on a subscription service where they won't make Game Freak any money. Some argue they're leaving money on the table, when they would actually be throwing money away having these games on a subscription service where the only one making money would be Nintendo. Game subscription services decrease the value of individual games in terms of their ability to sell copies. The only one benefiting from a game being on these services is the company who owns and runs these services. As far as those missing platforms, I do believe they will eventually have DS games for NSO, but the other systems will be grounds for remakes and remasters. We all know Nintendo isn't perfect, and nothing is, but they have done a good job of making their licensed library of games available commercially. They continue to add titles to NSO and put more games on the eShop. Publishing rights and commercial viability have to be taken into account when talking about game preservation. I do agree with those who cite live services being taken down too early. You shouldn't be able to leave people who paid for your game in the lurch because the game didn't meet your financial expectations. I also don't believe companies should be made to keep services up in perpetuity well past their commercial viability just so they can exist. You would have to go on a case-by-case basis for this sort of thing. Truth is, games have a few diamonds and a lot of rough. Much of what is worth preserving actually has been preserved. Most games disappear from memory because they should. Again, it's not a perfect system, but it isn't nearly as dire as many make it out to be. The truly sought-after games can still be found.